Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's panel, Beyond Climate, How Nature Loss Undermines Peace and Security. My name is Alice Rueza. I am the Senior Director for Global Policy Influence and Engagement at the Worldwide Fund for Nature. In this role, I work to ensure that WWF and partners' thought leadership and best practice continues to be highly influential and proactively shapes and informs the sustainability agenda and policy directions in Africa, Asia, Pacific, and Europe. Prior to that, I was the Regional Director for Africa. I also have worked with Conservation International in multiple roles and UNDP as the team leader for Global Environment Finance Unit in Africa. So today, we're pleased to bring you some experts to talk about the impact of nature loss on human security. Though imprecise, we use the term nature loss as an overarching term to more broadly cover causes and effects of environmental change than technical terms such as ecological disruption or ecosystem degradation allow. And along with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the Center for American Progress, and WWF, where I work, we are all part of what we call the Nature Security Initiative, which aims to raise and increase awareness and understanding of the threat and impacts of nature loss among the security and intelligence communities through research, outreach, coalition building, and inspiring action, with the ultimate goal that nature is embraced as the foundation for human, national, and global security. Through this initiative, we have developed a conceptual framework that establishes the intellectual basis of the nature security nexus. I think, Courtney, you can put up that slide. This conceptual framework seeks to show how environmental stress can lead to adverse security outcomes and identify points of intervention to prevent or impede those outcomes. So the socioeconomic and biophysical drivers of change seen on the left together drive environmental change, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem degradation. This compromises the benefits that humans gain from nature, called nature's contribution to people. These include clean water, energy, and timber, but also benefits such as inspiration and psychological well-being. Environmental change can threaten human and societal security directly or indirectly. The impairment or collapse of systems and institutions that support the health and well-being of people and their communities is an example of such an indirect threat. The degree to which environmental change evolves into human, national, and global security risks depends to a large extent on the social, political, and economic context. Should these types of stresses emerge in contexts where there is already weak governance, inequality, and poverty, for example, instability may escalate to the local and national levels. It is not assumed that populations experiencing hardship and suffering as a result of nature loss will automatically turn into conflict and violence, although the presence of existing conflict drivers increases the risk that nature loss pushes a society towards instability. So that was the background, and now I'll move on to our keynote speaker. I am glad to really introduce Monica Medina, the President and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society, an organization that works to conserve the world's largest wild places in 14 priority regions that are home to more than 50% of the world's biodiversity. Prior to joining WCS, Monica served as the first US diplomat designated to advocate for global biodiversity and as US Assistant Secretary for Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs at the US Department of State. There, she was very pivotal in the Biden administration's adoption of the 30 by 30 goal, the protection of at least 30% of the planet's land and oceans by 2030, and was a leading negotiator for the US behind the adoption of the historic United Nations Agreement to protect marine and biodiversity in international waters. In the private sector, Monica served as the Senior Director for Ocean Policy at the National Geographic Society and an ocean lead at the Walton Family Foundation. We are very thrilled to have you today. Welcome, Monica. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alice, for that very nice introduction and for all the efforts that you lead at WWF to advance conservation efforts around the world. We're grateful to you. And thank you to CAP. I'm very glad that you organized this panel. Again, this is such an important topic, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation, and it's really timely. Throughout my career, I've seen the ways in which climate change and nature loss have become interconnected with matters of national security, economic prosperity, community safety, and public health. What I know is that nature is fundamental to human life. It provides us with irreplaceable benefits that allow us to grow food, drink clean water, generate energy, and produce life-saving medicines. The world's natural climate infrastructure, including forests, peatlands, and coastal and marine environments, is already doing its job, keeping the world much cooler than it would be without them, by removing from the atmosphere upwards of half of the excess CO2 that we emit. Our economy is also dependent on these services, with an estimated 50% of the world's GDP produced from industries dependent on the benefits nature provides us. As the new president and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society, I lead an organization with nature conservation at the very heart of its mission. We are working to preserve wild places around the world and educate and inspire people to become stewards of nature through our zoos and aquariums that we operate in New York City. The awareness that we inspire at the local level helps the public to understand climate and conservation issues on a broader scale. And I'll just stop here to note, there was an article this week in our local New York Times about the importance of nature in helping people to cope with climate change, how it's psychologically important to us, and it gives us a place to find inspiration, peace, comfort, and hope. So as we're gathered here today, it's with the backdrop of ongoing and really troubling escalation of threats and conflicts around the world. The Middle East is descending into a regional war. Ukraine continues to fight against sustained Russian aggression and a very different type of global upheaval. The southern border of the United States has become a point of refuge for masses of people fleeing instability and domestic crises. These examples, in and of themselves, are overwhelming to think about and to try to resolve. But we cannot lose sight of the ways in which nature loss and climate change are contributing to and compounding crises around the world. No part of our world in these recent months has been spared from extremes sparked by the climate crises, whether it's droughts and fires, extreme temperatures, and an unprecedented marine heat wave. We've witnessed in the Northern Hemisphere the hottest summer on record, and it will likely be one of the coolest ones for the rest of our lives. Think about that. The half-degree Celsius difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is worth tens of trillions of dollars to the global economy, including large impacts on frequency and severity of natural disasters, sea level rise, food insecurity, poverty, and migration. It matters to the day-to-day lives of everyday people all around the world. A rapidly warming planet is a threat multiplier for countless existing conflicts. The world is trying to catch up on both mitigation and adapting to climate change, but the latter is not happening fast enough, and many, many more people are in harm's way. The loss of nature and the benefits we derive from it can comprise human health, like we saw during the pandemic, increased natural resource competition, decreased climate resilience of our communities, and heightened energy, food, and water insecurity. This instability leads to more recognizable security threats like weakened governance, weakened rule of law, forced migration, and direct conflicts over resources. Yet as the world transitions off a dependence on fossil fuels and through the comprehensive protection of nature, we can build our resilience to climate impacts and try to mitigate the spillover effect of geopolitical crises when they do arise. And I want to really emphasize this point. The comprehensive protection of nature is the way we both build resilience to climate, mitigate the spillover of these geopolitical crises, and provide the basic needs of people all over the world. So I'm really pleased that 5 years ago, WCS was one of the partners to launch the National Security Campaign with Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, and the World Wildlife Fund, with generous support from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And I can't say how impressive it is that all 4 of the major international environmental groups came together around this problem. Our goal is to educate U.S. policymakers about the importance and benefits of U.S. investment in international conservation efforts. The aim of the National Security Campaign was to strengthen Congress's bipartisan bench of House and Senate champions for U.S. global conservation funding streams, which at the time were threatened by drastic cuts proposed by the previous administration. And I'll pause here also to say that this wave of recognition of the tie between security and nature loss has actually gone beyond the US, and these organizations are helping to impact the amount of funding available through the German government, the UK government, the EU, and others. So we see the funding increasing, which is great. But we know the threats continue to increase as well. The world is less safe when organized criminals and syndicates profit from stealing and poaching countries' wildlife and natural resources, which fuels crime, corruption, and violent extremism. When climate change-induced hurricanes, droughts, floods, and landslides devastate communities around the globe. When shortages of fresh water, food, and other natural resources lead to instability and conflict, as we've most recently seen over and over again. And when exploitation and destruction of nature leads to zoonotic disease spillover from wildlife into humans, causing many, many problems, including the latest global pandemic, but lots of local and regional problems as well. Reframing the conversation around conservation through the rubric of security has brought non-traditional allies together to champion further U.S. and global investment in conservation. The U.S. funding streams we sought to protect 5 years ago have since grown 34%, from 510 million to 682 million. And think about that in the context of a Congress that's trying to cut conservation. These partnerships signal that investing in nature isn't a less proven solution to the climate crises. In fact, it's an investment in nature that is the best option. And I will stop and say, I think these numbers are actually low, because if you add in some of the infrastructure and other climate funding, much of it goes to adaptation and resilience. And I don't think we've even counted it in these numbers. So the numbers are definitely going up in the US and globally as well. We know we have compelling data that show the more that we work to drastically limit our greenhouse gas emissions, the less global disruption will occur. We know climate change is a terrible challenge and we have to cut our emissions. This is especially true for developing nations who are the least responsible for the climate crises. Yet, as quickly as we must work to reach net zero emissions, we must move to help regions adapt to climate change impacts. We can do much of this work through preservation and restoration of nature and the ecosystem services it provides. And indeed, these are the very countries who are crying out for more funding now, because they are the victims, because they are feeling the impacts, and because they don't have access to the funding now because it's going to creating mitigation projects like big energy projects in big emissions countries, which are needed, but not nearly enough for these other countries who are desperate for funding. We simply cannot protect societies, communities, and economies from climate impacts without protecting nature. There's no technocratic shortcut that will get us to where we need to go. And I will say there has been a lot of conversation, and some very important people have talked about the fact that they believe that trees don't matter. And I disagree. I respectfully say that they are wrong about this. They are short-sighted, and they're going to create an economy that forgets that nature is the very foundation of it. So I'm looking forward to, I know our whole organization and many others are looking forward to the Three Basins Summit coming up. The three basins in the Amazon Congo the Amazon, the Congo, and Southeast Asia are essential to our success in fighting climate change, to staving off biodiversity loss, and supporting global peace and security. Put simply, conserving nature leads to peace and prosperity for all. My challenge to every one of you gathered here today is to think through how nature impacts your operations, your missions and duties, and what capacity you hold to build awareness and coalesce action to conserve it. And I will stop again and say that it's empowering people that gives people hope, not only that we can solve the climate crisis, but hope that they will have a more prosperous and peaceful future. So let's come together and think about this and act collectively. And I was recently inspired by Pope Francis's recent statements in which he wrote in his Laute Deum that human beings must remember that we are a part of nature, not apart from it. He called out the unchecked human intervention on nature in the past 2 centuries as a fundamental reason why we're experiencing so many concurrent crises. He's a leader in the religious world, and I think he's on to a very important truth. We can do better. And in order to ensure a peaceful world for our children and our grandchildren, we have to do better. So thank you very much for the chance to frame this conversation. I look forward to hearing the panelists, and it's been an honor to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica. What a wonderful, wonderful way to start this with your framing. As you said, conserving nature leads to peace and security. That's important, and nature is fundamental. And it was really good to hear you talk about, the national security campaign and all the work that's been done. And you're right, this idea is now moved globally. Anne and I and Andrew on this call are all members of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Nature and Security. And we just met last week to start thinking about this. And we're very delighted to see that this issue is taking center stage. And as I said earlier, also our national Nature and Security Initiative, that we're starting to think about, and look forward to working with you. And thank you so much to you again for your leadership. I know that you and I in Sharm el-Sheikh sat on the same panel like this to talk about this issue, and it's good to see you supporting it again later. Thank you so much again, Monica.
Thank you.
So now I'll move on to introduce our panel of experts. Dr. Winnie Kiru, is Winnie here? Good. Winnie is a highly accomplished research scientist and wildlife biologist with over 25 years of experience in wildlife management, environmental policy, and global environmental advocacy. She's currently the executive director of the Impala Research Center here in Kenya. It supports research in central Kenya that improves ecosystem functions, conserves biodiversity, and enhances the livelihood of employees and their families who are predominantly traditional pastoralists. She is also the 2022 recipient of the Order of the Grand Warrior Award in recognition of her leadership in conservation. Welcome, Winnie.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much.
I will introduce Andrew Zolli, the Chief Impact Officer at Planets, a breakthrough space and AI organization that has deployed the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history. There, he works to ensure that the company's data, products, and services achieve their highest humanitarian, sustainable development, and scientific potential. He is also an author of the best-selling book, Resilience: Why Things Bounce Back. Welcome, Andrew.
Hello, it's great to be with you.
Yes. Last but not least, Dr. Erin McPhee is the professor of practice in climate security at the William J. Perry Center for Hemisphere Defense Studies, the founder and president of the Carioli Institute, and the UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has consulted regularly for the International Organization for Migration, the UN Agency for Migration in the Latin America, Africa, and Middle Eastern regions on the climate change conflict migration nexus, and is an expert on formerly armed actor reintegration. Welcome, Erin. Okay, so just to say that we will have a Q&A, and throughout our panel discussion, if you have questions, please input them using the Q&A function, and time permitting, we'll try and take as many of them as possible. after hearing from our panelists. So I will go on to the first question to all panelists. And I'll start with you, Winnie. How do you feel that nature loss, including biodiversity loss, pollution, overexploitation of resources, and invasive species, contribute to conflict risk and threaten human security? And how do the effects of nature loss on peace and security differ from what you're seeing with climate change?
Thank you very much, Alice. I first of all want to just say what a fantastic beginning of this conversation. Monica, your thoughts were powerfully communicated. Thank you very much. And I'll start with a quote by Professor Wangari Maathai, a woman that I admired and continue to really live by her principles. She said, in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground, a time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other. That time is now. That time is now, because there's so many challenges. When you think about nature loss, it seems so localized, its impacts are so local. When I think of that pastoralist that I encounter every day, who is now faced with issues of invasive species, opuntia, everywhere they look, to the extent that some of them are even unable to leave their enclosures, their homes, because of invasive species that they have no idea how to deal with. They're told, oh, they came from Australia. They have no idea where Australia is. But the species are altering their ecosystem. They live with those problems every day. I'm thinking of that pastoralist woman who travels 3 days to go and come back with 5 liters of water. And those 5 liters are what she's going to use for her children every day. So loss of nature, that young boy who leaves the home to look after the family herd, who 5 years ago, 10 years ago, came back with a full stomach, having eaten honey, wild fruits, all sorts of things, but now they're not there. He experiences nature loss every single day. What are the reasons? It's often degradation of our ecosystems. It's often overgrazing. It is often just doing what people have done traditionally, but then the results are changing. They're so different. And then it is everything that is happening far away where they have no idea what's going on. So nature loss contributes to conflict because it threatens human security. People have to just go farther for what is normal. To graze your cattle, you have to go farther. To feed your children, you have to go farther. To get a glass of water, you have to go farther. And then you have to compete with others. The resources are scarce. So increased competition and people fight. Loss of livelihoods. With all that time spent looking for the everyday resources, it means that there is no time to make enough to pay for your children's school fees, to buy clothes. Your livelihood, there is no time. Displacement, you have nowhere to live, while of course the effects of nature loss are exacerbated by the climate issue, the climate change issue, but nature loss is very localized. The impacts are felt every day, every hour, every living moment by the people who are faced with these problems. And addressing these issues is crucial for maintaining peace, for maintaining security. And they need not band-aid, but a comprehensive approach. We must think of environmental sustainability in a comprehensive way. I'll return to Wangari Maathai. We need a new consciousness. We need to be on higher ground. We need to stop being afraid to say it's not enough to promise. We have to do something about the suffering of these people. So to me, I think that these issues overlap: nature loss, climate change, but really sometimes because we spend so much time on this climate change issue, we forget the local impact of nature loss, the everyday trouble for women especially, because they're the ones who provide food and those resources in their homes. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Winnie, to start us off with that energy from Wangari Maathai. As you said, they are localized, you know, they are felt every minute, every hour. Andrew, same question.
Well, it's very hard to follow Winnie and Wangari, I have to say. But let me just offer an observation on an increasingly crowded planet. We experience a wildly different set of interconnected and opaque risks that Winnie's absolutely right. We have to have an internal change of heart. We have to have an internal change of values and orientation. But that orientation has to be married to a new way of understanding the interconnected nature of the risks and challenges that we face. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about a moment for the sort of the physics of the risks that we face. How do they unfold in time? What we see are long, simmering, and unobviously connected systems that percolate for a long period of time at the edges of our experience and then suddenly tip over into rapidly moving disruptions and disasters. At that point, they're almost impossible to deal with. They cause massive dislocation and suffering. So we're living through this period where we have, different systems connected to each other. A loss of nature changes the nature of the soils. It changes the nature of the ability to absorb moisture. Climate might change whether or not we're facing patterns in rainfall or invasive species that tip over into a growing crisis, an agricultural crisis, or a crisis for pastoralists, which in turn might initiate greater competition for the resources that are still there, which in turn initiates either conflict or forced migration. And pretty soon we start to see things that look like traditional, quote unquote, traditional security considerations that really come from the fact that we have collectively embraced a relationship with the larger natural web of life, the larger web of nature, of which we are a part, but we don't see the causality and the feedback loop between the actions we took over here and the consequences over here, often because those consequences are felt by people who are not responsible for the initial behaviors. And so in those circumstances, we must have a vision of security that is more inclusive, that is more connected where we understand that someone working in public health, someone working in food security, someone working in the maintenance of traditional livelihoods are all working in security. And especially those people who are working in conservation and restoration of the natural assets, which are our common heritage. So I'll spend more time later talking about what ways in which technology might amplify that work. But the challenge we have now is that we have a very narrow conception of security. You can't shoot at a sandstorm. You can't, bomb the climate crisis or a food insecurity crisis. But we need a vision of security that is much, much wider than the way that we think about it now. And I feel like our understanding of the interconnected nature of the relationship between nature and security is advancing faster than the institutional relationships and the kind of doctrines of security that define the global peace and security movements. And eventually they must come together in this century. That is the kind of tactics that we have to marry to the change of heart that Winnie mentioned at the beginning of her remarks.
The new consciousness that she mentioned. Thank you, Andrew. And I'm looking forward to hearing how data can help us make those connections. And thanks for that. Erin, to you.
Yes, thank you very much for your opening remarks and for all of the organizers for this fantastic and important event. It is hard to go last after such fabulous speakers. I particularly appreciate, Dr. Kiru, your humanization of some of these really complex problems, and Dr. Zolli as well, for the amplification of the panorama and landscape of security considerations that we need to be thinking about. So the many adjectives before security that we actually need to be considering at this point. So I'll try to add something a bit more complimentary so as not to repeat too much, but I think you both made some really important points, which sort of sets us up for some version of a need for a whole of government and whole of society approach to tackling problems in these domains, which is another way of saying a lot of what's already been said. My work does focus on armed conflict and reintegration of formerly armed actors, so I'll sort of lean a little bit in that direction. And I think one thing that's emerged consistently in my research is that nature loss is not a driver of armed conflict in isolation. These issues are exacerbating long-standing intergroup tensions in many countries. They're creating new sources of strain in already problematic relationships, but they need to be considered in the socio-historical context in which they're embedded. So yes, absolutely a major contributing factor. I think threat multiplier is often the phrase that's been used, but that needs to be understood within a context. So I'll give one example from some research that I conducted in Sudan. So longstanding tensions between agricultural and pastoralist populations, and then the eruption of major armed conflict. This was from many years ago, not referring to the current one, but I suspect these dynamics still hold. Armed conflict results in the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. About 100,000 of them settle in one location, which is sort of smack dab between where the agricultural and the pastoralist communities have long had conflicts over when and to whom the land belongs. In order to survive, the camp residents had to cut wood for fuel, which accelerated deforestation, which accelerated desertification, which dramatically negatively impacted both the pastoralist and the agricultural populations, and armed conflict and ongoing tensions erupted between all of these groups of individuals. So yes, there's climate change, desertification, there's environmental degradation and nature loss through deforestation, but you can see how they all embed in that confluence of many other factors, including armed conflict and longstanding intergroup tensions. I will definitely re-emphasize the importance of considerations of how these differentially, in fact, affect women, and just gender in general, because men also experience this in a differentiated way. There's a lot of gender-based strains placed on things like income generation and supporting families for men, in as much as implications for longer walks to get water, less access to health resources for women. Another example is also its stages in the life cycle. So, for example, in many communities in the countries, I'm thinking about Libya, Yemen, Sudan here, and Somalia, in many of the communities that are affected by either flooding or some other form of nature loss or environmental degradation, income reduces even further because of either crop loss or other issues with accessing livelihoods. And when that happens, the first children to be taken out of school are young girls. So already shorter time in schools, already a lot of difficulty in accessing them, and then compound that the effects of nature loss, and the girls are the first to be pulled out of school. Sometimes the boys remain, if that's a possibility for any children to remain. So both gender and life cycle as well. And then I'll just make one small final point to add a little bit of dimension to the thinking about armed groups and illicit activities. In my thinking and research, I like to delineate along three lines. First, the weaponization of natural resources. Second, nature loss as a result of war, and comparing that to nature loss as a tactic of war. So when I think about weaponization of resources, I'm thinking about, for example, a siege. which is about as old a war tactic as we have been warring, which is about all of human history, unfortunately, or the weaponization of water. So, for example, poisoning water sources. That would be sort of what I would categorize as weaponization of natural resources. The other would be something along the lines of nature loss as a result of war. So in South Sudan, a massive stretch of wetlands were destroyed because they were the battlefield upon which a war was fought, right? So they were sort of the quote unquote collateral damage of the armed conflict. So still important, but they weren't explicitly used as weapons or strategies in the actual fighting of war. And then finally, nature loss as a tactic of war. And I think this is becoming increasingly something that we need to be thinking about because as resources become more scarce, they become more appealing as weapons of opposing sides. And I'm thinking here, for example, in Libya, commandeering pipeline infrastructure in order to either delegitimize the government or both, to delegitimize the state and also to gain the revenues generated by the petroleum industry in Libya, by armed groups there. Additionally, the mining of farmlands in Ukraine. So that is, it creates tremendous food insecurity that is felt worldwide, and also generates the conditions by which recovery or even occupation of land becomes nearly impossible until demining missions are able to go through there. So just a few different ways of thinking about how nature loss factors into armed conflict and illicit activities. There's obviously quite a lot more, but I don't want to go too much over on my time. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm honored to be speaking with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, for especially bringing in those new angles, in terms of how nature loss, the weaponization and others. And because I don't want you to go last again, when I go through the second round of questions, I'm going to start with you. Having said all that and what you've told us, how do you think members of the security and intelligence communities can build upon the climate security groundwork that has been done to really include this nature loss in their conflict analysis, response, and planning?
Great, thank you. Well, be careful what you wish for then, right? Yeah.
Okay, briefly,
no, I really,
briefly. Yeah,
I know.
okay.
And I appreciate this question very much, and it's quite nice. I mean, I think one of the things that I appreciate about some of the partners with whom I work is the willingness to have a conversation across sort of security and defense and military and civilian and academic and NGO divides. I think there is quite a lot of co-learning that can happen there, and they tend to be somewhat rigid silos sometimes. So I'm very grateful for the question to think about this. I think really, Alice, some of the key strengths of the framework that you presented at the outset, I've generated something somewhat similar in my own work, though yours definitely looks much better. But is the important aspect that also Andrew mentioned, which is the multiple dimensions of security that we need to think about. And so I'm going to talk through some of those ideas in my comments. So the first is thinking about, obviously, there are two ways that the security sector, there are many ways, but there are two main ways that the security sector can sort of approach thinking about nature loss. One is in its own institutions and installations, right? So thinking about the emissions or the waste generated by, for example, military operations or installations. That's one way of thinking about it. The other way is integrating some of what I just talked about in terms of the use of nature loss or the implications of nature loss in the context of armed conflict into strategic planning, right? And I think one of the proposals that I've made is to actually integrate that kind of analysis, that kind of holistic, comprehensive analysis that looks at armed conflict, environmental degradation, and climate change, man-made as well as, well, it's not quite natural, it's all man-made, but environmental degradation and climate change together with other considerations of insecurity and context. I think they're a little bit left out as this tacked on element that can sometimes be addressed by other third-party analysts, but it should be considered as a transversal issue or transversal concern when thinking about analysis in context. And the other thing actually I want to mention too is governance strengthening. It's quite common in the context, at least that I've worked in, that there are laws, there are frameworks, and there are existing approaches that are created in order to address some of the needs with regards to nature loss, but they're not implemented. There's little oversight. They're often either generated at the national level and not supported either financially or through political will at the local level, or vice versa. There's some fantastic, innovative local solutions that have been generated, but they haven't made their way up to the national level. And so I think working on the strengthening of governance capabilities with a few caveats. One, connecting the national with the local. Two, making sure that these strengthening activities are done with a deep understanding of the local context. By local, I mean the sort of the state level context, and that they are not the overlay of internationally developed norms and frameworks onto a context in which they might not be relevant or useful. Also making sure that sort of the grassroots efforts are collected, identified, and assessed for potential scaling possibilities, and it needs to be inclusive. I think that the great opportunity that some of the nature loss challenges present us with is a bit of a righting of the ship in terms of consistently marginalized populations and ethnic and national minority groups. These are opportunities in which the implementation of, let's say, a community level initiative can be used to bring in those population groups that are traditionally marginalized from decision making. So I think inclusive advances are really could be sort of the silver lining to all of this. So I'll stop there and thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much for that very detailed thinking around how this could be integrated. And I really like the bottom up that you're coming up with, you know, how you bring, you're not imposing an international doctrine, but you're actually thinking, let's bring local. Andrew, to you. You are helping to fill a data and information gap through satellite imagery at Planet. What role can data play in the nature security nexus? And what trends have you observed?
Well, I really appreciate that question, Alice. And before I answer that question or address that question, I was reflecting on something Aaron talked about around the weaponization of nature. It was, I think it was Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE who took Baghdad in a single day by redirecting a river and a dam. And now we have the same things happening in places like Ukraine. There's all kinds of different ways into this discussion. But I'd like to address the question you asked, Alice, sort of by metaphor, since I'm assuming most of the people who are on this call are not aerospace engineers, are not involved in satellite imaging, are not involved in these advanced technologies. So I want to share a lesson from when we build these technologies, a design principle that's really important. And that is when you are designing a satellite, if you are ever lucky enough to get to work on one of these technologies, one of the things you have to do when building a satellite is you have to build instruments into the satellite that measure the position and orientation and change, the forces that are acting on the satellite, and measure them faster than those forces act on the satellite. Because otherwise what happens is the instrument can begin to tumble out of orbit. And if you're only measuring every few minutes, eventually the system can fall wildly out of orbit and the whole thing can crash. So you need to be constantly observing change on the satellite, at least as fast as the forces of change are acting on the satellite. Well, I have also a big piece of news for everybody, and that is that we live on a satellite. That satellite just happens to have 7.5 billion other astronauts on it. And likewise, there are very profound forces of change happening on the planet. What do we know about those forces of change? We know the climate's changing. We know that we're experiencing nature loss. And the essential thing is that we must measure change on the planet comprehensively and in high resolution and in both time and space, just like designing an artificial satellite, so that we can help maintain that sort of healthy system. So why is that important? Well, it's especially important right now because we live in a series of connected, interconnected disruptions and shocks. And, you know, it's like watching a seismograph go off, right? So after a long period of stressor, suddenly a system is disrupted into volatility. And every time the needle moves back and forth like that in rapid succession, it's associated with pain. People are disrupted, ecosystems are disrupted, the web of life is disrupted. So what we're doing today in our organization is we've built and deployed this enormous constellation of satellites that collectively image the entire landmass and near oceans of the Earth every day in high resolution. So unless you're an astronaut, every place you've ever been, we take a picture of from space at roughly lunchtime, noontime every day. And then we use the tools of artificial intelligence to extract the essential patterns and insights from that imagery. We watch change over time on a daily basis, so we can see every act of deforestation, every act of ecosystem degradation. We can see the growing of every field. And what we are doing here, and the role that data plays, is incredibly important in many different dimensions, but let me give you just three. The first one is that we make the invisible visible. The challenge for many of us in managing and governing these systems is that much of the change that happens outside of our consciousness. It happens, you know, human beings are very good at detecting change that moves at sort of 1 meter per second, like this. We're really bad at detecting change that moves like this. And we're also really bad at detecting change that moves like this, really, really slowly. But what we have today is an interplay of change between things that are moving very slowly and then tip over into crisis. So by continuously observing and by taking those observations and putting them in the hands of everyone, putting them in the hands of local people, putting them in the hands of the institutions of governance and social justice and climate justice and conservation and science together, we can create a common picture of what's happening in each place. And the reason that's important is because by observing continuously, we often can see the hints and forecasts of what's to come. We can begin to see, you know, there's an invasive species that's on the move here, but we're over here. We know it's coming here, right? So we can begin to build early warning systems. And the more we do those kinds of things, the more we can build policies, for instance. And I'll give you just one example. We have a thing we do with our satellites where we measure the moisture in the soil. So we can measure from space down to the first, like, say, 6 or 7 centimeters under the soil to get a sense for how much moisture is there. Too much moisture, and you get landslides. Too little moisture, and you get droughts. And the critically important thing today, that data is used as the underwriting instrument. It's the technology that enables index-based insurance for for smallholder farmers and for pastoralists in 28 countries around the world. These are systems that are designed to blunt the sharp edges of change. So the first thing we can do is make the invisible visible. That's critically important because by making it visible, you make it actionable. And then you can make it actionable within this inclusive security framework that we talk about. So if we can see the loss of nature happening in real time, we can take action on much tighter time cycles than we typically have. Many of these problems that we have come from the fact that we only learn about them after the problem has occurred. But if these technologies and this data moves us from reactive to real time, and then from real time to predictive. And in predictive systems, we can begin to move people from harm's way. We can begin to strengthen systems that might be at risk, but not yet lost in the nature loss context. And we can begin to build these new kinds of policies. And so the first is about making the invisible visible. The second is enabling these new kinds of actions. And the third thing that the data does is it gives us a common picture. So it allows us to report with accountability and transparency what's happening in the world in a way that, because the truth underwrites justice, because it underwrites action, it also, having a common picture, having an irrefutable picture of what's happening is essential for holding people accountable.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. That's, making the invisible visible, making it actionable within an inclusive governance. I think that's very, very powerful. Well done. Winnie, you are going to be our last panelist here before I jump into the Q&A. You have already called us into really a conscience being, acting with a high conscience on these issues. Now, you have worked to help women ascend to leadership roles in conservation. You've promoted gender equity, and we've heard a lot about gender and the role it plays at that. How do you see women and other communities at risk to these security, threats stemming from nature laws, and how can we act to really support them in your work?
Yeah, when it comes to talking about women and girls, you can start from all sorts of angles and you'll still hit the target. I want to just talk about leadership, because I think there's an absolute leadership crisis going on, especially where women and girls are involved. If you just look at the big documents from UN Women, United Nations General Assembly, globally, women hold just 26 to 27% of the parliamentary seats. That is the political seat where decisions are made, where money is allocated to make changes. So Andrew can provide all the data he needs and all the predictions he needs, but the money that's going to make the change will be voted in a parliament where only 30% globally. And in a lot of countries, there is less than, 5% women. Now, in local governments, the numbers are slightly higher, but it's only about 30%. Yeah. And then if you think about management positions, big NGOs or places where big money moves and big decisions are made, again, you're talking about less than 30% of these decisions are made by women. So universally, women are not at the table. Now, when you think about that leadership gap, and then you think that 1 in 4 women, universally, will remain abjectly poor, completely poor, going into 2030. There is no expectation that women are going to get any better. They're just going to remain poor. They will remain severely food insecure going into 2030. The women will have no water. Yeah, 60% of women and girls will have no access to education, and a lot of them, if any, will have maybe just a primary school education. Now, just yesterday, I was watching Kenyan news, and there were 3 items that just made me shudder. In fact, when I thought about this presentation, I think I should just check out because clearly I'm not making the difference I would like to make. One of them showed an empty corral in a nomadic pastoralist community in northern Kenya. And the newscaster said, see this empty corral? There is no goats, no sheep in here. The father of these daughters in this place has to trade off these girls to get some cattle inside this corral. And then they showed these young girls, 10-year-olds married off to improve the family herd. When they get married to 75-year-olds, 65-year-olds, because they're the ones who have livestock, that's the end. There's no more schooling. They are not going to parliament. They are not going anywhere. They're just going to live at that level of an unpredictable, severely hampered life. They are not moving anywhere. So why do I spend time on women leadership? It's because I'm impatient. While I would like to take lots of girls to primary school and to high school, I'm impatient about decision making. I feel that leadership roles in conservation, in business, in government, need to be taken up by women. I feel that if women continue to be missing in the decision making, in research centers, in places where data is then thought about and repackaged so that it makes sense to that woman who wakes up every morning and wants to make a decision about where to go for water or what to grow this season. Unless women are sitting in those decision-making places, unless they are the leaders, unless they are shaping the narratives, unless they are writing the policies, the lot of women is not going to change. I am impatient. I think this new consciousness needs to sit in the hearts of women who can do something. Not women who are spectators, women who are driving change. And so my impatience has led me to develop fellowships for women leaders. I am specific about seeking leaders and giving them courage and telling them the time for fear is over. You just have to reach out because your sisters, your daughters are suffering. And the suffering will only end if we make a big change. And the big change happens in the leadership space. So to answer your question, the issues of security, I see all the stabilization funds that are made available in places where there have been huge conflicts. None of those funds are allocated to restoration of degraded spaces. And yet, women are resettled in these places that apparently have been stabilized because men have been given work to do. And then they now have to go and start fetching water kilometers and kilometers. There was lots of money spent in workshops that were just attended by men. If they invited women to these workshops, they would tell them, you know what, can you spend some of this money in trying to build some water reservoirs? Can you spend some of this money in making sure that we can find food? Can you just grow some gardens? Can some of this stabilization money restore the environments that we need to survive? I feel that the lack of women in these decision-making spaces is doing nothing for security, is doing nothing for the future of the planet, is doing nothing for the environment. Unless we empower women, we are not going to change this nature loss that we are facing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Winnie. Thank you for that impassioned speech on women and women leadership. And I fully agree that we need to fix the governance. We can have all the data, we can have all the planning, we can have everything, but we must fix leadership. I agree with that. Unfortunately, we had so many questions to ask you, but we are out of time because you guys were so good. You gave many answers. Maybe there's a way, Courtney, that we can try and compile these questions and get some answers for our participants. I think that might be the best way to do. It only leaves me with enough time to thank you all our speakers. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Winnie. All of you for really humanizing.
Thank you, Alice.
Humanizing this.
Alice, yes.
Humanizing this issue, but also bringing us, you know, the real reality of the issues on the ground, the realities in the armed conflict space, the realities in the data space, and that the tools are there, but we have to have the courage and the leadership to really pursue them. Thank you all very much, and have a lovely, lovely day.
Thank you.
Good.